102.5 FM, KXSFLP San Francisco, and KXSF.FM.
You're tuned in to Spark, informing minds, inspiring ideas, igniting innovation. Let the conversation sink into your soul.
This is Kelly Marlowe, host of Spark. Today I'm talking with Elliot Berkman, professor and expert on motivational factors that contribute to the success and failure of personal goals. We will be talking about how best to create and sustain new habits or goals for the coming year. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Berkman.
Thank you for having me.
With the start of the new year, people make personal resolutions and goals that they want to set for themselves and improve their lives. And studies are showing that most people's resolutions fall off by the third week of January. Why is this?
Well, goals and behavior change in general are difficult. It's the primary, there's a number of reasons. I would say the single biggest factor contributing to the difficulty is the fact that in many ways we as humans are kind of built to form habits. And habits have a lot of upside. They make our daily life much more efficient. But at the same time, they work against any kind of new behavior that you might want to engage in. Takes kind of constant effort and focus to engage in something that is not habitual behavior. And so to the extent that your goal, your New Year's resolution, requires you to do something new, which usually it does, that means that you're going to be kind of working uphill, if you will, working against your natural tendency to engage in habitual behavior.
Does the way you set the goal make a difference, like how big of a leap you're trying to make?
Yes, it surely does. We know from a lot of research that not just what kind of goal you set, how ambitious, for example, how big the change is, as you noted, but also how you think about the goal itself. What are the exact terms that you use to describe the goal to yourself and to others, those kinds of things. But certainly, bigger goals are harder to achieve simply because they require changing more different aspects of your life, and so forth. But goals that involve, smaller changes are more feasible, and especially if they don't involve changing things that are really sort of deeply ingrained habits.
So then, how do you overcome the old and form the new?
That's a great question, and that's it's something that psychologists have focused on quite a bit. This question of habit formation: how do you build new habits? In many ways, I find a helpful way of thinking about goals is that it's when you're trying to change your behavior, you're doing two things. You're doing something new, which, as we noted, is hard and effortful, and you're trying to not do the old thing. Right, which is in some ways a separate beast. You're trying to create a new habit on the one hand, and also avoid engaging in the old habit. And there's certain strategies that can complement each other. So, for example, changing your context, going into a new place, or restructuring your world or your life, physically and kind of psychologically, helps with both. So, for example, it's fairly well documented that it is easier to engage in new behaviors. It's easier to change your habits when you're in a new context. So whether that means you've moved, or maybe you've just retired, and the structure of your daily life is very different. Those moments are really ripe for behavior change because they're the cues to engage in the habitual behavior that the old behavior you're trying not to do, sometimes they're not there as much. And then you can start to kind of create new habits in that kind of virgin territory that can then become kind of your new daily routine. So a great example is, let's say I've just retired and I'm a cigarette smoker and I'm trying to quit smoking. Well, for many smokers, one of the first cigarettes they might have is when they get in their car in the morning to go to work. So if I retired and I'm no longer getting in my car after I have breakfast to go to work, well, now that's a great opportunity because I'm not going to be triggered to smoke in that situation. Maybe instead I'm going to go for a walk with my partner. Well, again, so that's a great opportunity to say, let's create a new habit here. So now when I go for a walk, maybe I'll chew gum or something else like that.
So it sounds like to overcome the old, you need to remove the triggers, the previous triggers or reminders, or is a muscle memory of what you would do over and over again?
Yeah, absolutely. Removing triggers is a great way not only of changing old habits, but then also creating new triggers, new habits that then become associated with the new behavior that you want to do. So the essential ingredients in a habit are a cue or a trigger, as you say, and then the behavior itself. So what is the thing you want to do? And then a reward, something that feels good or is in any way rewarding. Those three things kind of all paired together over a few repetitions will create a new habit. So yes, get rid of the old triggers that are sort of prompting you to engage in that old behavior you don't want to do, but then also at the same time create some new triggers for yourself and then reward yourself. So if I'm that smoker who's just retired, instead of getting in my car, going to work, having a cigarette on the way, I'm going to go for a walk, I'm going to do something healthy, and then I'm going to reward myself in some way to reinforce that behavior.
But isn't it also about memory? Because we have this muscle memory, is to get up in the morning, and let's say the first thing you do is you have coffee, right? And then you want to stop having coffee. But that's the first thing your body knows to do in the morning is to get up and have coffee.
Right.
So let's say you have this muscle memory that's like kind of prompting you because out of habit. Is there anything we can do physically, or what is it physiologically that we would need to do if that's something that I guess physically prompted to do?
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, that's what you're describing as muscle memory. I think in psychology we might just call the habit or part of the habit. So I think there, your body or your mind, if you will, if it's a habit of mind, right, if it's thinking in a certain way, for example, are going to kind of be prompted to go in a certain direction, right? We have these kind of tracks, ruts, right, that we get in. And so anything you can do to kind of impose external limits on yourself can be really helpful. So changing the environment, maybe it means, putting your whatever it is that's tempting you further away from yourself. So you have to make a kind of conscious decision in order to go get it. For a lot of people, it's about, putting reminders of the behavior that you want to do in your way. So, for example, having your gym bag or your running shoes somewhere that you're going to have to see them and you're going to have to do something about that in order to go on with your day.
So I heard that if you do something for 21 days, it becomes a habit. Do you think that's long enough time?
I think it can be. I think the length of how long it takes something to become a habit can be much longer than 21. It can be much shorter than 21 days, depending on who you are and what you're trying to change. And as we said, the context. So if I'm, for example, on vacation in an entirely new place where I've never been, so I don't have a lot of pre-existing triggers for behavior, and I don't have any kind of routines and habits built up in that place, maybe after 2 or 3 days, I've formed a new routine, right? A new habit where now I know, in this Airbnb that I'm renting, here's how I get up and get coffee, and now it's a habit very quickly. On the other hand, right, if I've been living in the same context or doing the same thing for years and years and years, and I'm trying to change something fairly substantial, I could imagine it might take months. But yes, I mean, in general, I think the rule is the extent to which you engage in a behavior in a context and it gets rewarded repeatedly, whether it be for 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 days, is the route. You're on track for habit formation.
So what you're saying is try to remove the previous triggers as much as possible, or context that's going to cue you to do what you were doing before.
Yes.
That would be
that's
the first step.
Yep.
And then the second step would be create new context and new triggers for your new behavior.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And then the third step would be to make sure that when you engage in that new behavior, that you're rewarded. It's reinforced.
Okay. And then how do you decide what's the appropriate reward that will motivate you to keep going?
That's a great question. And that's an answer. The answer is really, it has to be very individual. For some people, it's as simple as taking a moment to pause and reflect that, hey, what I've just done is a step towards my goal, and I'm, becoming a better me, or I'm becoming the person that I really want. For other people, maybe it's something really concrete and tangible. Maybe it's a primary reward. So maybe I'm not trying to drink coffee, but I really like dark chocolate, and so I'm going to have a piece of dark chocolate when I skip the coffee. For others, still, maybe it's money, maybe it's financial, and there's actually software, there's websites out there that can help you do this. You can elect to, for example, put money into an escrow account, and when you change your behavior, whatever your goal might be, if it's losing weight or exercising, and you can verify it by having a sort of a third-party referee say you've done it, then you get your money back, or you can, it gets donated to some cause that you really like.
It sounds like you have to have a plan, let's say a vision or overall plan, and then you have daily milestones tied to it. Is that the best way to think about breaking down the goal?
Yeah, that would be a great way to think about it. Planning is really important, and it's often and on the one hand, it seems kind of logical and obvious. On the other hand, I think a lot of people go into New Year's resolutions without a plan, right? They kind of wake up on January 1st and say, hey, this year my resolution was to lose 10 pounds, and so, now I'm going to just start doing that. But that's, as you noted, that's one of the reasons people sort of fail so quickly. Taking a little time to plan out, well, what does that actually look like? What are the milestones? And, thinking ahead, what am I going to be doing, this week or next week in terms of eating, exercise, will remove a lot of the barriers. As I noted earlier in our conversation, anytime you're engaging in a new behavior, that's hard. We have to use parts of our brain that are kind of limited in a sense, like our ability to focus our attention on something or to hold information in memory. Those are limited capacity parts of our brain. And anytime you're doing new behavior, you're using those. Planning is a way of kind of preloading or offloading that work to a different time, so you don't have to do it on the fly, right? If I plan it out and I know, hey, on January 1st, when I wake up, I'm going to go for a jog, and I've even set up everything in my room so that when I wake up, I've got, everything I need right there that will serve as a cue. Then I don't have to pause and use those effortful brain regions to think about what I'm going to do.
What about accountability? I would think you have to build in some kind of accountability, right? Whether someone holds you accountable, it's harder to hold yourself accountable.
Yeah, accountability can be a great tool. I wouldn't say it's essential necessarily, but it can be really, really helpful for many people. And we being psychologists have done studies looking at accountability to others in various forms. So, for example, people who announce their goals on social media and are more likely to stick to them. And the more specific, the more concrete the goals they announce on social media, they're even more likely to stick to them.
So if they say I'm going to lose a pound a week, it's more likely to happen than to say I'm going to lose 10 pounds. And then there's no exact completion date or just 10 pounds this year, right?
Exactly.
It could be the entire year.
Yeah, exactly right.
What kind of ingredients have to be in the plan for it to work really well?
A good plan will have, they can become very elaborate, but I would say at least two pieces. The essential pieces would be a context for the behavior, whether it be a time, a place, a situation. plus the specific behavior that you're gonna do. And I mean, we could say more, but I would say that those are the two essential things. So if I say my plan for losing weight is to exercise, what I would want to say is, well, when and where am I going to exercise, and exactly what am I going to do? And then, of course, we could build in additional components, like, well, what are the sort of cues that I know are going to help me form a habit, and what are the rewards that I'll associate with that? But having, a time, place, context, and then a specific actionable behavior.
Do you think people tend to overestimate or underestimate what they're capable of when they have a goal?
Yes, yeah. People do in general tend to overestimate what they're, maybe not what they're capable of, but certainly what they are likely to accomplish within a specific time frame. And this is something people learn pretty quickly. So a way to get a little bit better at estimating your kind of work capacity or your behavior change capacity would be to just simply start tracking it. And people are often pretty surprised when they start tracking how they spend their time, how much effort they're really putting into a particular new resolution or a new goal. But you can learn. I mean, the upshot is we're over-optimistic about our abilities to do new things, but over time you can calibrate and you can become quite accurate.
So then I would imagine it becomes a downer because it's too hard to accomplish your goal or your new habit, right? Maybe the solution is to adjust it?
Yeah, you want to adjust it, and it's you probably have heard advice to start small in any kind of behavior change, and I'd say that's always good advice for New Year's resolutions too, which is start small, get small wins under your belt or small steps, and again that's good advice because it helps circumvent our natural tendency to overestimate how much we can do. Gets around that problem, but then it also makes sure that there's rewards. If you set a very small, easily attainable goal, even if it's not quite as easy as you thought it was, if you can still get there, that'll be kind of a quick win, right? It'll be a small reward for doing that behavior, and then you can build up. So certainly, I do think a best practice would be start small and build up, rather than shoot high and then adjust down from there. Though in reality, that's something that we often end up doing.
What are the hardest goals to set?
That's a great question. Some of them, I mean, it's different for everyone, but we could draw some general principles. I mean, the goals that are hard to set would be, changing behavior that is long-standing, behavior that is sort of a strongly reinforced, and something I would say a third feature of goals that are hard to change would be something that's really deeply embedded into our self-concept. So changing the way you think about yourself, any kind of behavior change. So if I tend to think about myself, for example, as a lazy person, and I've decided my New Year's resolution is to exercise more, well, at least for me, that resolution is going to involve not just changing my behavior, but really actually changing the way I think about who I am. I need to sort of overcome my self-image as a lazy person and to think about how can I start to think about myself as an active person, or at least maybe a lazy person who also, does physical activity sometimes, right? We need to find a way to reconcile that. And so for many people, the goals that are harder to change then become things like cigarette smoking, changing our eating behaviors. Those two are quite common. And actually physical activity, all because, for example, if you talk to smokers, they think about themselves as a smoker. That's sort of part of their identity, and especially if they've been doing it for a long time. And so becoming, learning to stop smoking is more than just actually breaking that physical habit, which is hard enough on its own, but also changing the way to think about myself as, well, I'm not, now I'm a former smoker or a non-smoker. which can be, quite a lift.
It sounds like you really need to know yourself and what you're capable and not capable of then?
Want to really know yourself? I would phrase it not so much about what you're capable or not capable of, but understanding what are going to be the pain points for you individually. And on the flip side, also thinking about what's going to be really rewarding for you individually, right? Is it going to be rewarding for me just is that going to be sufficient just to know that I'm taking steps towards this, or do I need something more, right? Do I need to really try to very concretely reinforce myself? And the pain points too, thinking about, being honest with myself. Well, it's like, how much do I really want to think about myself as an active person? Is that something I really care about? Or if I somehow achieve this goal, how valuable would that be to me? And if it's not, those are the things that are going to be challenges, not insurmountable ones, but ones that you're going to have to spend some time, as we've discussed, really planning out and thinking through how you're going to make this, how this becomes a feasible plan in your life.
So you have to realize that if you're a lazy person, it's going to be harder to become active overnight. And let's say, take yourself to the gym every morning, because it's not something that you typically do. And you have to ask yourself, am I really up for this challenge? And I'm up for all the pain points that are going to be involved in making that happen. And really exerting that extra effort. Yeah.
No, that's right. And one other thing I would say is, thinking about on the point of knowing yourself, it's often a worthwhile exercise to ask, well, why am I, sort of the way I am currently, right? So if I'm, say, inactive and my goal is to be more active, I might say, well, why am I inactive, right? Is it sort of, just happenstance? Is it just because of the situation I found myself in? Or is it something deeper, right? Maybe it's, everyone around me is like this, and, my whole life I've sort of been brought up to be this way, and I think of myself as part of this culture of inactivity, if that's the thing. And so really kind of getting to know yourself and the reasons for acting, because this is coming from this perspective from clinical psychology, which is that, a lot of behaviors are motivated in some way, or at least they kind of make sense for us, right? Behaviors make sense, even ones that we sometimes think of as maladaptive, overeating or using substances. They do something for us. So what is it that behavior is doing for me? And really trying to kind of get at the root cause of that, if indeed, there is one, and trying to kind of tackle that, or at least deal with it in some way before trying to change it.
So it sounds like it's easier to set goals that are closer to who you are than who you're not.
Yeah, I agree with that, yes.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break and thank our underwriters. Be back on success in setting personal goals and habits with Elliot Berkman.
Did you resolve this year to contribute more to your community? Get involved with a worthwhile nonprofit? Be more chill and not let the world get you down? Well, you can do all three of those by partnering up with us here at people-powered independent radio KXSF. Join our volunteer community and help us out here at KXSF. Become an underwriter of KXSF programming, or just make a tax-deductible donation that will keep us on the air through 2020. To find out more, go online to www.kxsf.fm. You'll find more information as well as our donate button. Thanks for supporting KXSF 102.5 FM, San Francisco.
This is KXSF 102.5 FM, streaming worldwide at www.kxsf.fm. And you're tuned in to Spark with Kelly Marlowe, informing minds, inspiring ideas, igniting innovation. Let the conversation sink into your soul.
I was talking with Elliot Berkman before the break about setting successful goals personally. So let's start with the top resolutions or habits that most people have going into the new year. One of the toughest ones seems to be losing weight. How can we lose weight and sustain it? Because it's a constant, it's not as if you can lose 10 pounds and stay there, right? It's sustaining it that's also equally challenging.
Yeah, that's right. I would say yes, there are differences between that kind of initial change, right? Getting yourself to just act in a different way than you've acted before. And then that kind of later phase that we might call maintenance or endurance, right? Sort of getting that behavior change to stick. And so whether it be eating or physical activity, we can make changes in the short term, often just by kind of good planning or using our prefrontal cortices to kind of come up with new ways of moving through the world. But then the kind of durability of those behavior changes are going to really depend on how well we formed habits and how well we've restructured our world to kind of remove cues for the old behavior.
What would you recommend? Let's say 10 pounds seems like a lot, right? So do you start with 1 pound at a time?
Starting small, planning up front, thinking about the way that you're going to change. And again, I think with dieting, I think it's intuitive, and most people might have experienced this, right? You can do it in the short run. I'd say the real challenge with maintaining any kind of behavior would be, how do you restructure your world so that your world then nudges you into that new behavior instead of the old one. And a lot of the challenges can be kind of the way our world or our environment is structured. A lot of them end up being social. A lot of them end up being, where am I going to go to eat, or what kinds of foods am I going to find in my household with my friends and with my family. And if I'm the only one changing the way I'm eating, but everyone else around me is still kind of on that old path, well, then I'm going to, in the long run, I'm going to find myself surrounded by cues and triggers to go onto that old path. And each time I'm tempted to do that, I'm going to have to use these quite limited prefrontal resources to kind of redirect myself away from those. In the long run, that's an uphill battle that more often than not will fail. And so I'd say for maintenance, it really is about either bringing people along with you, or really changing the way you interact with people so that your world supports your new behavior.
So it's much more complicated because of environmental factors. And if you want to socialize, you're probably going to end up eating and drinking more, or you can choose not to socialize so you can lose that weight, it sounds like.
Right. Or socialize with different people. But again, that's really hard. I mean, that's a much bigger challenge all of a sudden. But it certainly is one of the reasons, why, as we spoke about earlier, behavior change can be so hard. It's that, well, if I'm a smoker, I can sort of sit here on my own and decide to quit and get rid of all my cigarettes and all the cues. But then, of course, I'm a smoker. It means I've probably been hanging out with other smokers. And then when they want to, go get together, well, their world is still structured around, let's go to a restaurant or a bar or something where it's easy to smoke. And, so I'm going to be sort of sucked back in. Of course, if that's my social network, those are my friends. I don't want to completely remove myself from that. And so then it becomes quite difficult.
So it sounds like you, in the beginning, or if you're really committed, you need to remove as much influences as possible, either, for a length of time, or maybe even replace it altogether for it to be successful.
Yep. Or wait, a third way would be to kind of wait for an opportunity where your environment is going to change naturally, or was going to change anyway, if it will. So I brought up retirement, for example. So that's a good kind of case in many people's lives, if you're fortunate enough to retire, where your social world does get restructured. You're spending a lot less time with your coworkers, for example, all of a sudden, and maybe you're spending more time with other people. And those are points where there's sort of a natural reorientation or restructuring of our world. This happens if you move to a new city or a new location. There's all these kinds of inflection points where if you have something like that coming up, that's a great opportunity to kind of build in new cues to new behaviors if you want to change.
Or it sounds like you will have to create it yourself. So let's say you just start joining a running club, right?
Right.
And now you're surrounded by runners and you're being pushed to run. I mean, it sounds like, or else you have to just completely dramatically change your environment to make it kind of fit into your new, your new model of what you want your life to be.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it sounds fairly dramatic, but I'd agree with that. And it's not to say you need to change everything. I think there are probably smart ways to do that, where you very kind of strategically select the things that you want to change. So a running club is a great example. So you join a running club, and so that's hopefully that can become sort of a new part of who you are and a new part of who you hang out with. And then maybe you want to just pick one or two features of your life, not the whole thing, but to kind of ask this question, well, what is it about my life or my world that is sort of pushing me in a sedentary direction? Maybe it's not all of my friends. Maybe it's, this one group of friends that just wants to kind of hang out and play video games. And maybe I can come up with a way to, sort of spend a little less time with them and a little more time with the runners. And that kind of sets you on a better course.
The first one is diet. That's the most popular on the list. And then second is exercise, which is kind of related, right?
Right.
I guess you could eat healthy, but not exercise.
Right.
And then it's about getting into a new routine and having social motivators to help push you.
Yeah, social motivators are good. I think with both diet and exercise, they're kind of interesting because they are often with exercise, that's an example of what we would call an approach goal. It's saying, there's something I want to do. I want to approach, right? I want to, exercise more. I'm kind of positing a new behavior. And sometimes those can be a little bit easier than, on the other hand, usually dieting is it can be what we would call an avoidance goal, which is, well, I want to eat less, junk foods, or I want to eat less unhealthy food. And so sometimes there's ways to do both. I mean, dieting, again, is a good example. It's like, well, maybe I want to eat more healthy foods. And so with dieting in particular, just because of the way, our physiology works, a successful way is to actually just forget about the junk food part. Don't even frame it as an avoidance goal. Think about it just as approach, right? Eat green leafy vegetables and more fruits and, whole grains. And the extent to which you kind of eat more of those foods, you're going to eat less of the unhealthy foods just because we kind of have a fixed capacity usually for food. Right, so that's the classic strategy of, well, eat the salad, eat a really big salad first, and then even if you have something unhealthy coming after it, if you're already kind of full, then you're going to eat less. With exercise, it doesn't work quite the same way. With exercise, it's very much sort of I'm approaching this new behavior, and then with something like quitting smoking, for example, that can be it's almost a pure avoidance thing, right? It's just not do this behavior that I've been doing. So there's important differences in those kinds of behaviors, and the way we think about them can have a big impact.
So it sounds like exercising may be easier than dieting. So it may be easier to exercise and lose weight that way than to tell yourself not to eat all the following foods or eat as much. Would that be a better approach to losing weight?
Well, though, I'd caution. I mean, often, exercise is worthy in its own right. Physical activity is a healthy thing to do. It, decreases your risk for heart disease and cancers. But if you're trying to lose weight, the question of whether you should exercise more is actually complicated because people tend to eat more when they exercise more. So a lot of people will actually gain weight when they start exercising. For a number of reasons. You increase your calorie intake. Typically, you overshoot it. It's like, well, I just went for a long run, and it feels like I've burned 1 million calories. Well, you probably haven't, but then you eat, much more than you exercised. Another reason is you can actually build muscle mass depending on the kinds of exercise you're doing. So, like I said, exercise is great. There's lots of good reasons to do it on its own. If you're trying to lose weight, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the the best strategy.
The best strategy. Okay. So the third most popular resolution is to save more and spend less, which is probably harder now that you can do online shopping.
Oh, yeah. It's so hard. And it's so hard because, we're sort of working against our natural tendency to value rewards, immediate rewards over long-term rewards. That's something that seems to be kind of a fundamental feature of our psychology, of how we think. And in some ways it's adaptive, right? It's sort of like, well, what do they say? Two birds in hand is better than one in the bush, right? Which is the stuff that I have now, or no, it was the other way around, right? One in hand is better than two in the bush, which is because I know I have this stuff. And so again, the future is uncertain. You never know what's going to happen. Things that are right here now that are tangible are kind of more, there's less uncertainty inherent to them. And that seems to be built in to the way we think about the world. And so that then presents a challenge to savings, because it's like, well, I have this money now. Why should I save it for later? Who knows what's going to happen? I could get hit by a bus tomorrow. I'm not saying that's what people literally think, but I'm saying on some level that kind of logic is sort of built into the way we think. So what psychologists call temporal discounting or delay discounting, this idea that rewards in the future are apparently to almost everybody worth less than equal rewards now. So that's a challenge. And again, it's this kind of the same principles, though, of behavior change apply, which is you want to have a cue, you want to engage in the behavior, then you want to reward yourself. And so it might become ironic, but what you want to do is, if you're trying to build a habit of savings, is to actually give yourself an immediate reward for every time that you save for your future.
It's an interesting challenge now, in the sense that if you could reward yourself immediately, why put it off, right? Mm-hmm. Instant gratification aspect where you can put it off, but it's there.
Yeah, no, that's right. Right. And that's basically that's why it's so challenging. And I'd say that's a big factor why we have this huge savings crisis in the United States right now, that we, essentially almost everybody or a huge number of people in the U.S. don't have enough savings.
So I would imagine this is tougher than losing weight. Or you think it's equally
a challenge? Yeah, to compare. It's a hard comparison. On the one hand, losing weight, you're kind of fighting your biology. Saving, you're fighting your psychology. There's structural factors, right, that make it hard. A lot of people can't save money just because they don't have enough money to make ends meet now, which is a big problem.
But let's say you could save money. Yeah. So right. You would save money by giving yourself a challenge of not spending for a certain number of days or opportunities, and then you reward yourself by giving yourself something?
Yeah, that's the way I would do it. If I had to sort of do it manually, if you will. I mean, I think I'd say the easiest way is just to take the decision out of your own hands entirely. This would be the equivalent of, like, if you're trying to eat more healthily, just, if you can afford it, hire a chef, right? Hire somebody to make all your food for you, make all the decisions about what you eat for you. I don't think most people would sort of love to do that, even if they could afford it. But sort of the equivalent of that, right? That would be easy, which is like, well, I never eat unhealthy things because that's just never an option. With savings, there's so many good technological tools now where you can, you sort of save, the savings happens before you even get your paycheck, for example, or, you can have things automatically deducted from your bank account. So then the rule becomes, well, I can basically spend whatever I have in this, in this pot, kind of knowing that my long-term savings has already been kind of squared away. So just don't even make it a decision that, like, each month I need to choose to save money. That's going to be difficult. So
you're saying that just have a strategy of setting something aside early and then not think about it, not touch it, right. And then just spend what you have after that. That's probably the best way to do it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, essentially what you're doing is you're making, like, a single decision, right? One decision to say, enroll in this program that automatically does these deductions. And I'd say, almost anybody could do that one time. We could sort of muster the will to just one time make this good decision, and then it's done, right? And then just leave it, and kind of everything else after that you can spend on impulse to your heart's desire, but still know that you're saving.
Okay, one more resolution that's common, which is learning a new skill or hobby. It kind of falls off, right, over time. What's your suggestion? Yeah.
That one, so learning new skills, I think usually it's a few things that are related to some of the principles that we've already discussed. So one is this idea that the behavior needs to be rewarded. And at first, usually we're bad at new things, right? So there's a kind of a natural barrier, which is I try to do something new and I fail, or, maybe I'm learning knitting and the first thing that I knit is really ugly. And it's just like, okay, well, so you're not getting rewarded in that sense. So that's a barrier. So thinking about how we can set goals, small goals, or so that we can reward incremental progress, even if we're not getting to our final goal. And then the other thing is planning, which that even if you're learning and you feel like you're making progress, it's still a fairly large change in our behavior, because what you're doing is you're setting aside time to do this new thing that you hadn't set that time aside before. So unless you plan very concretely about exactly when I'm going to do this, then it's not going to happen. So goals where it's sort of like, well, in my spare time I'm going to do this, or I'm going to start to learn this, are not, I would say, not very well formulated, because they depend on you then kind of in the moment making decisions to do something new or different or something that you haven't done before, which is going to, those are the hardest kinds of choices to make. So if you can plan out ahead and really kind of block out time or block out avenues for yourself to engage in that behavior, that's going to position you to be successful.
So it sounds like it's about prioritizing time, making sure you prioritize for it.
Yes, I would say it's about prioritization. But even the next step, even more than just asking, what does it mean to prioritize, right? Does it mean, hey, anytime I have 20 minutes, I'm going to sort of do this instead of that other thing? Or does it really mean like, no, I'm going to put it on my calendar so that, even if I have no free time today, it's actually blocked out, right? I've already taken the step to reserve the time in advance. So, I think we can say, I'll prioritize something without really thinking through what that means or how that's actually going to happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and then it's the practice, right, that falls off, because every time you're learning something new, you have to take the time to practice each day.
Right.
And then to make that time to practice each day and be committed to it.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, it's about, if it's more than just prioritizing, if it really comes down to planning and squaring away that time each day, coming up with a plan that's actually feasible and workable in your life is going to be really important. And in an ongoing basis, as you said, because learning usually, whatever it is, usually takes a while.
Okay, time for a short break. We'll return more on successfully fulfilling your personal goals and habits in the new year.
Support for KXSF comes from the Music Store, an independent record store located in San Francisco's West Portal Business District. For more than 2 decades, the Music Store has featured 2 floors filled with music and movies, bins and bins of vintage vinyl, new and used CDs and tapes, and rare, hard-to-find DVDs and videos. You can pick up a replacement record needle and even learn to play the guitar, all in the same visit. The Music Store, located at 66 West Portal Avenue. Thanks for supporting KXSF 102.5 FM San Francisco. This is KXSF 102.5 FM, streaming worldwide at www.kxsf.fm. And you're tuned in to Spark with Kelly Marlowe, informing minds, inspiring ideas, igniting innovation. Let the conversation sink into your soul.
Elliot Berkman and I were talking about the top resolutions for most people in the new year before the break. And we were talking about how it's about prioritization, planning, and taking small steps towards your goal. What about genetics? Do you think genetics play a role in how you are successful in your goals and personal habits?
This is a contentious one, or potentially controversial, but I would say yes, absolutely. Genetics do play a role, and they could play a role on a number of different levels. We can start with maybe the less controversial, so the kind of goal-specific way that genetics might play out. The goal-specific ways, which is, there's well-established genes or, groups of genes that are involved in different behaviors. So, for example, eating or alcohol use or nicotine addiction. In fact, we know that there's different genes that predispose someone to become more likely to become addicted to nicotine. Other genes, different ones, that will predispose somebody to kind of maintain that pattern of addiction. And still other genes that are related to making it easy or difficult to break that addiction, to overcome addiction to nicotine. This is fairly well established in the literature, and there's similar patterns with other drugs of abuse, with alcohol, with food, for example, the way food tastes and how rewarding food feels. So in almost any kind of behavior, you could identify, and people have identified genes or patterns of genes that might make it easier or harder for somebody to change the way they engage with that behavior. I'd say on a kind of higher level, broader level, like, are there genes that make someone good or bad at goals in general? I'd say that it's more that the jury is still out. Would it surprise me to learn that there was some gene or group of genes that sort of coded for whether it was easy for me to create a new habit, for example? No, that wouldn't surprise me at all, given how kind of important habit formation is to human survival. I'm sure there's lots of aspects of our biology that's linked to habit formation. What I would say, even if let's suppose there are genes, and let's suppose I'm a person that has, the genes that make it hard for me to change that particular behavior for whatever reason. I would say that, human behavior is quite complicated. I'm certain that there's no gene that codes for a specific behavior per se, right? It's not like there's some gene for, physical activity, right? There might be genes that code for, how for example, how painful does something feel?
But you did mention that some people have higher pain tolerance or threshold than others, right? And if you have, right, I would imagine if you have higher pain threshold, then you can take on more, and you can push yourself harder.
That's right. Yeah, and there's genes. So I guess the way to think about it is there's genes that code for these sort of very low level aspects of human behaviors, like pain, or the way something tastes. Right. Sure. I can imagine that there's genes for how reinforcing is a sugary beverage. Right. That there might be some gene that kind of indicates, hey, when I have a Coke, it feels really good, versus somebody else, maybe it doesn't quite feel as good. Pain's another good example. Right, all those things. But again, there's no gene that codes for that whole behavior of having a lifelong habit to, eat too much sugar. Right, there's no gene for that. Right, genes code for lower level things, and humans are really creative. Right, we can always come up with new solutions to problems. So, for me, the way to think about it is, my pattern of genes might make it, slightly easier or slightly harder to change this behavior. But they're never deterministic in that sense about our behavior. That even if I'm a person where sugary beverages taste great and change is really hard, and breaking habits is really hard according to my genes, I can still do it, right? I can still I can engage other things, right? I can plan. I can use tools. I could, for example, there's products on the market right now that it's like it actually looks like candy. But it blocks the sugar receptors, the sweetness receptors.
Oh, I like that.
In your mouth. Yeah, I think it's called Candy Crush, actually, or Sugar Crush, something like that. And so then it's like, okay, well now, I basically use this tool to kind of overcome my genetic limitation, if you will. So sure, maybe, these sweets would taste really good to me, but I can make a decision to just, use this tool to overcome that.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because sugar is very addictive, right? Even if, let's say you say, I want to eat less sugar, if you just have a taste, you're going to crave it. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you are. Yeah, sugar. And eating less sugar would be, that's a good goal. I would encourage that, for almost, any disease we've looked at, and certainly in terms of weight and obesity, so cutting out sugar is a great thing to do. But easier said than done. I mean, I think for cutting out sugar, you'd need to think about all of these things that we've talked about, which is I need to plan, like, how is that actually going to happen? And, I do some introspection. Well, what is sugar really doing for me? When I go for that sugary food or beverage, what function does it serve for me? And really kind of taking a look at sort of how I can fulfill that function some other way, how I can change the sort of structure of my world so that I don't encounter it as often. Ultimately, a lot of these tips boil down to this interesting question of how do I change my life so that I don't have to constantly make the decision to eat sugar or not, right? Or whatever the behavior is. I don't want to be faced with that decision of, like, right now I could either choose to do the thing that I've always been doing in the past, or I could try to choose to do the new thing. So as I said, more often than not, when you're directly faced with that kind of decision, it's sort of a recipe for failure, because of the way habits work. There's such a pull towards the old behavior that what you really want to do is just avoid that decision entirely. Just make it so that you rarely ever have to actually make that choice.
But could you do that by creating a negative cue for yourself? Like every time you think about sugar, or you think about something negative, and pairing that to make it easier for you to, like, kind of have a negative response to it? I mean, could you train yourself to just think negatively about certain things so that you avoid it, right?
Yeah, you can do that. And, certainly that's that old trick of, put a rubber band around your wrist and snap yourself and you think a certain way. I think that can work in the short run. With punishments like that, thinking negatively or having a negative experience, they'll prevent the behavior when there's going to be a punishment that happens. But once the punishment stops, they don't really endure much longer than that. Which is why people usually try to do the flip, right? It's like, actually what you want to do is reward yourself for the new behavior, for the thing you want to do. Because habits are formed based on rewards, and habits aren't necessarily formed based on punishment. If you want to create a habit, it's about rewards.
But don't rewards die off too, and you have to keep giving yourself rewards to make it work?
Yeah, every once in a while. But I would say compared to punishments, rewards endure longer. And hopefully what they can do is they can get you past that initial hump, right? That initial sort of behavior change is so hard and I need to think about what I'm doing. If you can get past that stage and sort of start to form the good habit that you want, then that kind of buys you a little time. It gives you some runway to continue to restructure your world so that you're not tempted by that old behavior.
To wrap up, set a plan, take baby steps.
Mm-hmm.
They should be realistic, correct?
Yes.
And how many?
Realistic, yes. That's going to be individualized, right? What's realistic sort of in your lived experience? And
how much time do you think? So I always hear 21 days. If you do something for 21 days, it'll stick. And you had mentioned that it depends on what it is. But you have to give yourself enough time, I would imagine, before the habit changes or breaks, or you move on to, if you feel like you're moving forward with your new goal.
Yeah, that's right. 21 days or even 14 days, right? The first 2 to 3 weeks, that's sort of that initial phase where I would say you don't even really expect to have your new habit yet, but expect to or hope to try to have changed your behavior. So that's where planning might come in. I would say let's plan out the first 2 to 3 weeks of exactly what you're going to do. How do we sort of get this off the ground? Maybe it's 2 to 3 months after that, which would be, hey, if I keep doing this behavior for 2 to 3 months and reinforcing it with cues, right, that's when I can sort of start to say, yeah, I've got this down on a habitual basis. And then, beyond that, still, that's maybe the kind of maintenance phase.
And then rewards is about small, meaningful, not actual things. It doesn't have to be, it could be something you enjoy doing.
That's right. Yeah. Personal. Humans are social creatures, and, we learn from each other very powerfully. We can help each other. And we feel very accountable to each other. So that's something that can cut both ways, right? It can promote the old behavior, but if you kind of strategically think about your social world and recruit your social resources, that can actually help you change as well. Social
support is the last component of where it could just make everything come together stronger in reaching your goal.
That's right. And specifically thinking about social approval, for example.
Social media sounds like it could be a great tool where you could say, I've set this goal, and then you can come back and you can say, I met my goal, and then you, not just approval, but you get support, you have people cheering you on. So that could be a good way to put yourself out there and make sure you're committed. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it can be a tool for commitment, right, or what we sometimes call pre-commitment. And then it can be, like before the goal. Social media or, social networks in general can be a tool for before you start, right, committing or announcing your goal. And then you then kind of feel obligated to your social network. And then afterwards, right, as you're making progress, to the extent that you're making progress, you can use it as a reward, as reinforcing.
That's great advice. And it sounds like that's probably the way to go in terms of making sure that you have that sustained support.
Yeah, I'd say that could be a kind of a linchpin in your goal pursuit and in maintaining goals, yeah.
Thank you for joining me on Spark today, Dr. Berkman.
Thank you for having me.